Welcome back to Live from Our Living Room. I'm Ethan Plotkin. I'm joined today by Professor Keshia Pollack Porter, who chairs the Department of Health Policy and Management at Johns Hopkins University's Bloomberg School of Public Health. Pardon me, that was a mouthful. Professor, thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for having me, Ethan.
So today we're talking about the ways that the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act passed in November can remedy some of the racial inequities generated by infrastructure investments in the past. And this is a complicated and confusing subject. I mean, an argument has emerged among skeptics of these provisions that roads can't be racist. So first of all, if you could just ground us in the historical context, has infrastructure been used to limit intentionally or otherwise economic mobility for racial minorities?
Yes, is the short answer. And just to provide a little bit of background, it is fair to say that infrastructure quality varies by class and by race, right? And if we think about our highly class stratified society, highly racial stratified society, we know that place matters, right? And because place matters, we know that higher income communities tend to have better access to infrastructure, such as better equipped schools, better maintained roads, cleaner air and water. And so we know that class matters. We also know that racial inequality is also built into our infrastructure. So we know that low income households, for example, are disproportionately households of color, and they are among the most at risk of experiencing infrastructure failures. So yes, infrastructure varies by race, by class as well, just adding to the complexity that you just named.
And one way that the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, will keep it bipartisan infrastructure for shorthand. The one way it tries to remedy this legacy is through a reconnecting communities provision. And in the course of writing the legislation and now during the implementation process, we've heard examples of destructive highway projects all over the country, in Rochester, New Orleans, elsewhere. But you're in Baltimore, so let's talk about Baltimore. What's the story of Route 40 in the west end of your city?
Route 40 is on the west side of Baltimore. And actually, if have you driven on Route 40? Are you familiar with the road out there?
I've been to Baltimore. The only thing I remember is the aquarium. I was very young. I imagine I've been on the road, but
well, the aquarium's a great feature, but in thinking about Route 40, we're talking about communities, and we're talking about this road, right, that ends sort of at the highway that we know it cuts through communities. And I think the thing that's really important to know about this particular roadway is that it is really hard in Baltimore to get from east to west if you don't own a car. Like, I just want to name that. Not only are we talking about communities that were separated by the installation of this major roadway that then leads to the highway, right? And what does that mean for communities that maybe had close cohesion or connections that were now displaced or other things? The other part of this issue is that if I live on the west side in Baltimore and I don't own a car, it is incredibly difficult to get to the east side. And so here's a perfect example of a decision that was made about installing a roadway, right, that is all kinds of tied to issues of racism and oppression and keeping certain communities away from other places and disconnected. So I think it's really important that when we see examples like that, we cannot let history repeat itself.
The first step here is obviously recognizing that there's a problem. And then the next step would be to remove this highway and to replace it with a green space or just anything to bring these two sides of the community back together. But that presents a real challenge for city planners. You know, you don't want these disappeared highways to serve as invisible barriers between high income neighborhoods and low income neighborhoods. So how do we reintegrate both sides of I-40, for example, or Route 40 in the west end of Baltimore?
Yeah, I mean, this is such a critical question. I mean, I think it really starts with centering equity and community, right? So if we think about bringing two communities back together that have been really separated for so long, Where do we start? Well, we start by talking to the community, right? Like that might seem very novel, but how about we talk to the residents who live there? How about we talk about their vision for what their community could look like? And understanding that it's so important to name names when it comes to disinvested communities, that we think about, are there investment incentives in terms of working with communities that we are, whether it's green space or jobs or other things, like what can we do from a real community investment strategy to bring wealth and resources and opportunities to these communities that have been disinvested in for so long, right? But it has to start with talking to the community. Me or any planner can't come in and say, this is how we're going to transform this community. Let's talk to the residents and see what their vision is for a safe and thriving community. And they might already say, you know what, we're okay, or we need these things, or we don't need these things, but we have to talk to community.
You've been quite supportive of the infrastructure bill, as have we at BPC, but you, like us, have been concerned that even really good legislation can be derailed during the implementation process. So diving a little bit deeper here, how can agencies work with local communities to prioritize equity promoting projects and processes during implementation?
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, this absolutely comes down to implementation. And I think that there are a few very clear strategies. One gets to what I just mentioned, which is involving communities. And that is genuinely and authentically engaging communities, sharing power, giving communities a voice when it comes to decision making, sharing resources, right? So there's a whole way where we can change our processes, right? Where we can, again, center community voice. We also can think about, again, what are there some incentives that can be given to developers and planners to work with and to invest in those communities that have just been lacking resources for so long. I think that there also in the bill opportunities to think about funds that are going to the states, right? In terms of, there's no explicit statutory requirement on how states can use funds to advance racial equity, for example, right? Like, I think that there needs to be intention around that, right? When there's competitive grants going out, beyond saying consider equity, you know, what about having a proposal review that names racial equity as a criteria for funding, right? So I think a lot of that can be lifted up in terms of some strategies for the process, as well as engaging community, building local capacity, and making sure the community is centered. And finally, just acknowledging that racism is real and naming those communities that have been, again, disinvested in for so long.
At this point, I feel like I have to pause and ask, you know, you're a public health professor, you work at a public health university. Why is infrastructure, of all things, so central to your work?
You know, one of the things I was really excited about with this law is that there's so much good stuff in here for public health. So let's think about climate resilience, right? So there's a lot in there around resilience related to climate change. And, you know, climate change has already begun to increase the frequency and severity of extreme weather events. Well, we know that people of color in this country are particularly vulnerable to climate change's detrimental effects. And so there's a lot of investments in there for climate change adaptations. And we know that climate matters for your physical health, for your mental health, for your emotional health. And so if we think about even communities coming back from a disaster, being able to have climate adaptations where communities can come back, where we think about flood risk, for example, how do we mitigate those vulnerabilities? Communities can only thrive if we are really focusing on ensuring that they are resilient to the detrimental impacts of climate change. That's just one example. Another one is all the roads, right? So safety. We know that about 40,000 people die a year on the roads. Well, we know that in this law, there's funding directed towards addressing serious injuries and fatalities on our roadways, as well as funding for walking and biking, ensuring that our built environment, our roads, our where we live, learn, work, play, pray, like these environments are also accessible for people who have disabilities. We know that there's ways to center equity here too, but lots of good stuff for public health, particularly around walking and biking and people being in communities where they can be outside. That's been so critical during this pandemic, and to do it safely. right? People should be able to walk and bike in their community and not be afraid of being killed by a car.
That's a fascinating framing, especially on the climate change piece. I mean, I think we communicate about climate change in a way that's sort of devoid from the reality that a lot of people feel every day. It's polar bears, it's melting ice caps. I've never seen an ice cap in my life. I've never seen a polar bear, but I have felt the effects of pollution. And I know other people that have. Zooming out even more, I think generally the conversations we've had about race over the past several years have focused on the function of law enforcement and access to education and employment opportunities. How does public health figure into these conversations, especially as we reflect on now 2 years of COVID-19?
I think this pandemic has just revealed for so many people how important public health is in a way that I have known my entire career. And I think it's my master's degree is in epidemiology, and like people know what an epidemiologist is now, right? I think that's pretty cool.
And everyone happens to be one.
Exactly.
To one degree or another.
Exactly. And so, I think that excitement is really important. And I think the pandemic has also shown how we need to invest in our public health infrastructure. We have seen it here. We have seen the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on communities of color, on people of color, on our healthcare workers. And it's really been a tough time. And I'm encouraged for the future of public health as we think about what do we need to do to support our public health workers, our health department employees, our physicians and nurses and people who are working at the bedside, and also the importance of prevention. The thing that I think is so important, Ethan, is around something you might have heard called the social determinants of health, right? So we know, for example, that if you were an essential worker who tended to be mostly low-income workers or people who, operate the transit systems that we need to take to get to work, or the people who worked at the grocery stores, they didn't have the option of working from home like you and I are doing right now. So we know that those individuals were even at greater risk. And so we think about the risk to your jobs and how that come into play with this pandemic. And so I think that for individuals who hadn't thought about public health in that way, I think this pandemic also reminded us of the importance of where you work, where you live, also for the pandemic and for risk, and for, again, being able to stay home, the importance of paid sick leave, like all of these important social policies, I think where it became more apparent for certain people.
Last question, pivoting back to infrastructure, we're set to host an event on Wednesday, March 9th this week with Mitchell Andrew, former Louisiana governor, who's now leading the White House's implementation efforts. What's one thing you'd want to hear him talk about?
I want to hear him talk about how they're engaging community. How is the White House planning to ensure that the dollars that are going to states as they get down to the localities are centering community? Again, I think that it's possible here. Beyond saying consider equity, no, it's requiring equity. It's requiring consideration. It's requiring attention. So it's not just consider equity and maybe it sounds like a good thing to get behind. No, I mean, I think this is a real philosophy. There's a real chance to do something different here and to require attention to equity, to require attention to racial equity, because again, we can't let history repeat itself, or we're going to have more communities that are torn apart by some highway that we install. And we're going to see communities that have been disinvested and continue to be disinvested in. And that's just not acceptable. We can't allow that to happen anymore.
Well, I think whether it's the equity provisions, the climate provisions, or whatever the laundry list of incredible things that this bill is setting out to do, the word of the season will be implementation. We're really excited at BPC to be working with the people making these decisions to keep them open, honest, engaged, and really appreciate you doing the same.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really appreciate the work of the BPC and the emphasis on implementation. Again, so critical, so critical.